So as you've noticed, this is a slightly unusual panel. And even more so, I guess, from this point forward, we've just been given a paper by a scholar of the American founding. And in case this is your first Center for Constitutional Studies conference, this is what they are all about, giving UVU students, Utah Valley community members, a chance to partake of high-quality scholarship about the fundamentals of their own nation. But now you're going to hear from a scholarly team, which consists of 2 students, and myself. Again, Carl Eric Scott is my name. I'm the assistant director here at the center. Each of us is going to give you a presentation, but ones that are briefer than the standard academic panel presentation. Danielle, I hope she's going to stay with us, and Mark are both UVU students and what we call wood assistant workers, students who work for the Center for Constitutional Studies. Now, about 70% of the work they do is on something called the Quill Project. Quill is headquartered in Oxford, England, and its project is an innovative digital platform that models and reconstructs the creation of negotiated texts, especially constitutional conventions. So let's see, I think Danny's working on the display. I'll show you maybe the landing page in a moment. But just remember Quill Project, and we'll show you some about it in a moment. Now, due to the work of an earlier cohort of CCS Wood Assistants, the Quill Project has modeled the 1787 Constitutional Convention that gave us the U.S. Constitution. For those of you new to the founding, you have kind of the Revolution, you've got a period with the Articles of Confederation, and then in 1787, that summer, there's a convention that gives us our Constitution. It is signed on September 17th. It's not ratified till sometime in the next year, 1788, and it really gets going in 1789. Our task this morning is to show you, and we've already been given some of this, how studying that convention can teach us many fundamental lessons about American federalism. Professor Ward showed you kind of how Madison's lead up to the convention enriches our understanding of federalism, but we're going to really focus on the convention itself. And we're going to do so by looking at 3 convention-connected topics in federalism. In the course of doing so, we'll also be demonstrating or talking about how the Quill platform can aid you, whether you are a professional scholar or not, in the study of the convention. Now, these particular Quill Project Wood Assistants have been hard at work this last year modeling the Quill Project. Oh, and I've got my page up, wonderful. They've been doing work on the Utah Constitution, okay? And it's not up yet, but we're thinking maybe January, maybe February. We're getting close, okay? And that's the convention of 1895. But let me show you Quill a little bit. And this is the landing page. And let's expand it a little bit for you here. And if you go down, you're going to find, this is really what I want to point out to you. You go here to this flagship Constitutional Convention of 1787, and this is what you see. And it takes a little bit of getting used to, but there's a lot of features on here. The most important is the feature called Secretary's Desk. Later I'll show you something with the statistics view. In fact, maybe I'll just pull that up right now. And so we're going to get another platform along these lines for the Utah Convention of 1895. All right. Well, let's introduce you to our students. Oh, one more thing with Quill. On the outside table out there, we've got some pamphlets that'll tell you more about it if you're interested. Okay, so look for this pamphlet on the outside. Danielle Maddox, she's right here, is a junior, a major in English, and a minor in constitutional studies. Today, she is presenting on the universal negative, which was a proposal at the convention to give Congress the power to veto state laws. Mark Waite is a senior, a major in political science. He is presenting this morning some of what he has discovered about presidential selection and federalism at the convention. I'm going to be giving you, again, my name is Carl Eric Scott, a brief talk on what I've learned about Alexander Hamilton's views on American federalism as expressed in the convention. I'll probably be abbreviating those remarks because we're running slightly behind schedule. Now, while Danielle and Mark have already learned more about the creation of the Utah Constitution than anyone except a tiny handful of scholars know, and they've even discovered things that no one knew before about the Utah Convention, we are having them present today on the U.S. Constitutional Convention. Part of the reason is that they and 10 other UVU students traveled this summer to Oxford University to study the framing of the American Constitution. UVU students in the audience should note that we're doing this study abroad next summer also, so if you're interested, talk to me. Now, why did I take this class to Britain to study the creation of our American constitutional republic? Well, it was because one of the persons who knows the 1787 convention best is the Oxford history scholar, Dr. Nicholas Cole, the creator and director of the Quill Project. He is with us today, looking at his phone at the moment, and he will be our keynote speaker at lunch. Dr. Cole and I led the students through the most famous of the Federalist Papers, a number of important anti-Federalist papers, and through large portions of James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention. Our students experienced the unique Oxford tutorial system of examining written work and debated the merits of the Constitution in a lovely room at Pembroke College. And Pembroke College was our host institution among the 38 colleges that make up Oxford. People think Oxford University is one thing. It's actually, is it 38 or 39, Nicholas? 38 colleges. And let's see, here they are in the room I was telling you about, debating whether the Constitution was a good thing or not in the spirit of the anti-Federalists versus the Federalists. And here they are in front of a lovely window at Pembroke College displaying their Wolverine pride. So we're very grateful to Dr. Cole and Pembroke College for this great opportunity to study our own Constitution. Now, why should you, want to study the convention? Why should you turn to it to learn about American federalism? The simplest answer is the convention is where that federalism was created. A slightly more complicated answer is that it was created by negotiation, that therefore there was no single human mind. I know people are going to say a lot about Madison today, but let's just keep that in mind. No single human mind that built it according to a particular design. One thing that means is that some of the convention delegates who contributed the most to our federalism actually disagreed with one another about what the best design for it would be. Lee has already quoted you the most famous passage about American federalism from Federalist number 39, where Madison says, the Constitution is neither a national nor a federal constitution, but a composition of both. But as you're going to see, and as Lee already mentioned, he really thought that this universal negative was the thing that was going to really make it work. Madison did not get his way on this issue, and that's not the only one upon which he didn't get his way. If I have the chance to talk about Hamilton today, he got his way on almost nothing at the convention, and yet winds up in the Federalist Papers obviously being one of the most important defenders of the document produced by it. So I hope, I could say more, but I think maybe you've gotten a little bit of a hint of why it's a good idea to try to get back inside the messy kitchen of the convention, out of which the surprising and seemingly perfect dish known as American federalism emerged. I now hand you over to your first guide to making sense of the messiness within the convention, Danielle.
So what Dr. Scott failed to mention was that during our Federalist versus anti-Federalist debate,
You're not going to mention this, are you?
I am, the Federalists lost And I'm pretty sure it was influence of Dr. Cole and his British heritage. And Pembroke College has this kind of British feel to it. You just sit there and you just seep in all the British. And you forget how wonderful our Constitution is. So, how brilliant was that move? I don't know. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and talk to you on the universal negative here. Let me get this pulled up. Well, I broke something. I often break quill when I'm, there we go, when I'm studying it. So that's not going to work. I don't know how to do this, so. But I'm just going to go ahead and start out. So the universal negative, I want to start out in context. I don't know why this isn't working for me. Typically, I do the technical parts behind the scenes, but it's not working for me, so let me.
Just take your time. It's going to be over there on the
It
edge.
was, and then I exited, so who knows? I don't know. Okay, well.
Well, try going up. Wait. Can you get out of this one?
Let's hoping I could. Okay.
No, don't do that.
I don't know what happened. That's what I get for making jokes about Dr. Cole.
Hide others, try that. I don't know, maybe not.
Someone has better suggestion. I'm open to
Try
suggestions.
to go down here.
I'm gonna quit PowerPoint.
There we go.
There we go.
It's going to be in this area.
I'm gonna reopen up. Okay. We have Skype calls with Dr. Cole once a week, and it usually goes along the lines of, "Hi, Dr. Cole, I think I broke your program." And often I do. All right, is that going to be the right button? No. Slideshow? I can't see anything.
You could probably just go down here and click on
All
them
right,
one by one
all
as
right.
you need them.
I'll try this again,
Yeah.
and this doesn't do what I want it to. Okay. And it comes up for you just fine? All right, I apologize. It was different on the screen. Okay, so the universal negative, what we're really looking at the convention is you have two different strains of power. You've got this idea of this national government. The national government needs power to go forward. The Articles of Confederation gave some powers, as you heard, to the national government, this form of national government, but they couldn't execute them very well. And then you had the states who, on this extreme end, had complete and total power. They had control. There was a lot of conflict arising, but they wanted to hold on to that power. So they didn't want to lose in this fight to create this new national government. They didn't want to lose their autonomy, their individualism, the right to govern themselves, their sovereignty. So one way that we can explore this idea, these competing ideas of power, is through the negative. So when I refer to the negative, did it go? All right. When I refer to the negative, I'm talking about this legislative negative. It's a power given to the national legislature to veto, negate, and overturn all state laws. It didn't give any provisions of the kinds of state laws, just a general all state laws. Now, for instance, if we're going to look at it in contemporary views, we've got state police force. That's one of our state laws. We've got, our gambling laws, liquor laws, age of majority. That's different for all states. We've got even the death penalty. So there are all these things that are under state control. And the idea here is that the national legislature could come in and strike down these laws if they were to interfere with their ambitions and their goals. Madison was a great proponent of this, this idea. Now, the interesting thing about this legislative negative, was that it didn't make its way into the Constitution. It's not something that we see end up, but we have provisions like the 6th article of the Constitution that gives a supremacy clause, and you can find its influence there, and as well as in judicial review. You can still see that there needed to be this idea of a supreme law, but not at the risk of losing state sovereignty. So the legislative negative was introduced in the beginning of the convention, at the very start with the Virginia plan. It's in the 6th resolution. There are 15 resolutions of this plan, and the 6th resolution outlines the powers of the legislative. So here is the negative clause. It says, to negative all laws passed by the several states contravening, in the opinion of the national legislature, the Articles of Union. And this is a huge deal because the national legislature would have a judicial, an executive, and a legislative power. This separation of powers was not in place, especially when given this power of the negative. So what I used to research this was Quill. The Quill platform is this wonderful tool. It really is. I've been working on it for over 1.5 years. I absolutely love constitutional research. It has been so wonderful. And the great thing with this is there are different tools of research on this. I'm going to tell you about 2 ways. I can't go into depth on them. That's kind of something you can explore on your own. So the first way I decided to research this was topic search. You can go in, students have already connected keywords to practically everything that's happened in the convention. We have everything in the Virginia plan. There are keywords connected to all the debates, to the votes. So I went through, and the first thing I did was search negative. It comes up with 3 different events that relate to my subject, the universal, this universal negative. And I could look at that, knowing the platform, and say, all right, it was brought into discussion, they debated it, and it was immediately rejected. And so that was one way I looked at the negative. So I could look at the debates, I could look at that initial proposal when it happened, and the vote on it. And then this other way I decided to look at it, I wanted to see the negative in context of the 6th resolution. What were they discussing? What was going on? So in this next way I looked at it, this visual is, it starts off, the single document is the 6th resolution. And it splits off into these branches, and I was able to look at every single time they explored the 6th resolution, when they brought it, when they talked about it. I think this is a little earlier version, so it's missing some of the discussions in it. But one of the big things that I found was the very first day that this was introduced in the Virginia plan. They introduced it, they sent it to committee. The committee looked over it, they said, all right, let's look at the 6th resolution. They gloss over the negative. It didn't even faze them. Now, when they first start to debate the negative, was when it was strengthened in power. So this is the original negative clause, to negative all laws, and Mr. Charles Pinckney strengthens the clause here, to negative all laws which to them shall appear improper. There is this form of a blank slate, yeah.
See if this is turned on. I guess it is. We need to talk a little
To be
closer.
louder, I'll be closer. I won't move. That's all right. Anyway, so he strengthened this clause to give it an indefinite power. Now, this is what James Madison said, who urged the adoption of this power. He said, an indefinite power to negative legislative acts of the states is absolutely necessary to a perfect system. He was convinced that this national power was necessary for a perfect system. Now, I'm of the states' rights mind. I am all about state sovereignty. When we were in England, I was talking to someone, and he was so upset that our national government wasn't taking more control over our laws. And I was like, well, you do have to understand that we have states, and they have powers. And he's like, what are you talking about? And I was like, well, you should do a little more research on the United States, because we have this dual system of national and states rights and laws. Now, this sparked this debate. The first thing that was brought in was this worry that all of a sudden we wouldn't have control over our internal police force. They did not want a national police force. So that was the absolute first argument against that. And then the next one, John Dickinson says, it is impossible to draw a line between the cases proper and improper for the exercise of the negative. So how do you control that? So the Congress just gets to choose what's proper and what's improper. What are their bases? What's their criteria? How are we supposed to keep them in check? They're having this judicial power over the states. Gunning Bedford from Delaware says, will not these large states crush the small ones whenever they stand in the way of their ambitions or interested views? You're always talking about ambitions. We want to keep ambitions checked with ambitions. Well, who's going to stop this national government from taking over it? How do they know they're not going to be reduced? Their state sovereignty isn't going to be reduced. So this is, you can start to see the struggle of power, this pendulum swinging back and forth on who should have the power. And this is one of, I think, the greatest proponents of federalism is, where does the power lie? Is it going to be with the states? Is it going to be with the national government? Or are we going to be able to combine those together and still experience the benefits of having a national government, but remain independent and have sovereignty? So this debate kind of goes on, and it ends, and you can look at the vote that takes place. It's a 3-7 vote, and this idea loses. So Madison, he doesn't give up, but it takes, this interesting thing here is they're just really opposed to this universal power. And then it goes on for about a month. They don't talk about it until, so this is June 8th. And July 16th, they start talking about the 6th resolution again. And this time, it's presented, this negative is presented again, but with a little more specified, and they change it so that they have a little more criteria of this negative power. So they postpone it until the 17th of July, where they start discussing it again. It says, to negative all laws passed by the several states contravening an opinion of the national legislature, the Articles of Union, or any treaties subsisting under the authority of the Union. Another debate comes along. Madison again urges that they need this power. And Gouverneur Morris, he is from Pennsylvania. He goes ahead, and he's not naturally a states' rights guy, but here he says the proposal of it would disgust all the states. A law that ought to be negative will be set aside in Judiciary Department. He says we can't give that power to the legislative government. Again, this vote loses. This amendment loses. They erase the legislative negative from consideration in the Constitution. And you think it's lost. They're not going to discuss again. But they still understood that you needed a supreme law. The national government had to be supreme. But they wanted those states' rights. They didn't want to be overpowered. And so if they had adopted this, the states' rights would have been weaker. There wouldn't, at this point, have been a great enough check and balance system over the national government. And we can see through the 6th article of the Constitution that they did in fact say this is the supreme law of the land. But in the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights, in the 10th Bill of Rights, it says that the power not given to the national government is reserved for the states. And in order to make this work, they found ways around the universal negative, but we still see the functions of it in our government today.
All right, thank you, Danielle and Dr. Ward, for those remarks. I will do my best to speak as understandably and loud as possible. As Dr. Scott has outlined, the title of this panel was no accident. Federalism was indeed an issue discussed at the 1787 United States Constitutional Convention. While I realize the daunting limitations that accompany a brief 10-minute presentation on a subject as dense as presidential appointment, I also recognize the amount of importance the delegates of the convention placed on ensuring that each state's voice, no matter how small, had the chance to be equally recognized. This summer, I traveled with a group of fellow Wolverines to Oxford University to study the foundations of American constitutionalism as part of a study abroad. With that opportunity of a lifetime came the chance to study the debates about presidential selection and understand just how much this idea of reconciling state and federal differences was on the minds of the founders at the convention. That experience was not only beneficial for me, but for the dozen other students who took part in the program, experiencing firsthand UVU's engaged learning model. This talk will identify individuals present at the convention who were key in the discussion over selecting the executive and outline why and how, even through changes to the electoral system, the founding concept of federalism has been maintained today. Now, when we look back and consider how we arrived at our current system, we often speak of James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, etc., and with good reason. These are individuals whose fingerprints are definitely on our electoral system. However, I would like to introduce you today to an individual who I also think has his fingerprints on our electoral system, and that man is Pennsylvania Delegate James Wilson. Wilson's earliest proposals, though initially rejected, focused not on selecting the executive in the national legislature, but rather through a proposed body of state electors tasked with electing the national executive. As an annotated passage on the Quill platform puts it, Wilson was trying to grant the executive independence from the national legislature, while at the same time avoiding making him a creature of the state legislatures. It is also important to point out here that Wilson was one of the original advocates of allowing the citizenry to decide for themselves who their executive leader should be. Had he not stood in opposition to differing views, our current means of presidential election would most likely look much different and present less of an example of true federalism. The next individual at the convention I would like to discuss and who provided a proposal about presidential selection was James Madison. However, Madison's opinions ran completely counter to that of Wilson. In fact, in the Madison and Edmund Randolph-led Virginia plan, it states, "A national executive be instituted to be chosen by the national legislature for the term of years." Although this proposal carries with it more features of federalism than, say, a proposition that called for a direct popular vote, Madison's idea of electing a president could be seen as bypassing the people of each state, while instead relying on individuals tasked with a job they were not originally selected to do, as the electors in Wilson's proposal were. Next is an individual that I was actually not aware of until a few weeks ago, and his name is Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut. And his proposition is a perfect example of why many of the proposals at the convention were turned down, because they lacked detail, although I point him out today because his proposition is interesting and it speaks to the concerns that were on the minds of many of the founders when it came to selecting and electing an executive. On the Quill platform, explaining Ellsworth's proposal, it says, "Ellsworth's proposal suggests two alternative modes of election. The default would have been to allow the national legislature to choose the president, but that in the special case that the president was eligible for re-election, the choice would have been thrown instead to electors in the states. Ellsworth's explanation for this suggestion is recorded as being that by this means a deserving magistrate may be re-elected without making him dependent on the legislature. The assumption here is that a president seeking re-election needed to be defended from the legislature, not by, but from the legislature, who might be trusted to choose a president in the first place, but which could not be trusted to threaten a president with replacement. It is perhaps therefore assumed that the electors in the states could be better trusted to vote to maintain a president in office, even if they were not the most suitable or expedient body to choose him in the first place. Likewise, a president who showed insufficient independence from the legislature might presumably be removed by these electors. And again, although this proposal makes sense and clearly outlines the concerns that the founders had related to the executive branch, Ellsworth's proposal was turned down because it lacked sufficient detail. However, it did, as I mentioned earlier, establish the central question facing this important decision. How might a worthy executive be chosen who would enjoy a meaningful degree of independence? Now, regardless, it's clear that the Founding Fathers actually did not fear the executive branch as much as, say, they did the legislative branch. As Alexander Hamilton puts it in Federalist 68, again, the Federalists being the anonymously published newspaper articles under the name Publius in defense of the Constitution, Hamilton writes, quote, "The mode of appointment of the Chief Magistrate of the United States is almost the only part of the system, of any consequence, which has escaped without severe censure, or which has received the slightest mark of approbation from its opponents. The most plausible of these has even deigned to admit that the election of the president is pretty well guarded. I venture somewhat further, and hesitate not to affirm, that if the manner of it be not perfect, it is, at least, excellent." Now, I understand that the system which we currently adhere to is not in its entirety what the individuals at the convention agreed to. Now, the biggest reason for this, I believe, is the emergence of political parties. However, I also believe that with the emergence of the political parties as they came onto the scene, federalism actually strengthened. Now, first, let's understand what the original wording in the Constitution said regarding selecting a president. Quote, "Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors, equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding the office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector," unquote. And additionally, the earliest plan called for each elector casting 2 votes for president, with the top vote getter earning the title of president and the runner-up vice president. Now, of course, this is not the system that we adhere to today, and this is mainly due to the fact that once the parties came onto the scene in 1796, or a little before then, but we need to remember that in 1787, parties were really not on the table. But in 1796, we have John Adams elected as president, representing the Federalist Party, and Jefferson vice president, representing the Democratic Republicans. And of course, they start to realize, maybe this isn't a good idea if we're going to have people from different parties serving together. And in 1800, this concern was multiplied as, although Jefferson and Burr, who were elected president and vice president, were part of the same party, they ended up tying, and the vote was sent back to the House. And actually, I believe the 1800 election is actually one of the more fascinating elections in our country's history, so I'd encourage you to go on the Quill platform and diagnose that for yourself. But because of these 2 elections, the 12th Amendment eventually is passed. And this is the amendment to the Constitution that calls for electors casting separate ballots for president and vice president. So now you're probably wondering, okay, Mark, how did political parties encourage more opportunities for federalism? Well, I believe it's best understood by the idea of a 2-tiered party system, or state and national party apparatuses. Therefore, presidential candidates make continuous stops in separate states because they know it's just not enough to win over the endorsement of the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee or the national party system. Instead, they have to honor each state's electoral sovereignty. Additionally, this is why I believe it's possible to have a popular Republican governor in a blue state that continuously votes Democrat in presidential or U.S. senatorial elections. And a perfect example of this is in Massachusetts, where Governor Charlie Baker is by most polls the most popular governor in America, polling around 70% in approval rating polls. But of course, we also know that in Massachusetts, Senator Elizabeth Warren, not necessarily a Republican, and in 2016, Massachusetts voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton. However, how is it possible that they continuously have Republican governors? As we know, Mitt Romney, a past Republican governor in Massachusetts. Well, it's because of federalism, because the state candidate or the state leader is allowed to distance themselves from the national party. And this is possible, again, because the federal level of government, or the federal party, once again respects the power of the state, or the state party. Now, although there have been many changes to the electoral process of election, and although we do not adhere to a system specifically of one individual at the founding, the ideal of federalism has been maintained today and made stronger. Our current system, although not perfect, is, as Hamilton put it, at least excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. That was really well done. And I am going to, maybe limit myself to about 7 minutes. We have actually 30 minutes remaining, so that'll give us about 23 minutes for questions. So if you have a question for one of our panelists, be thinking of that right now. My favorite part of our presentations was the long quotation from Alexander Hamilton that Mark just gave us, because I'm an Alexander Hamilton fan, was so before the musical, I'm proud to say. But it's really kind of painful for me this morning. I have to sort of unveil to you what I regard as Hamilton's most shameful moment, at least politically. I'm not talking about his personal life. There was a more shameful moment there. And let's see, I'll do some more playing around with our PowerPoint here to get what I want to show you. Hamilton, that's the universal negative. We don't want that one. We want, Hamilton, he does not have a lot of influence on the Constitutional Convention as a whole. There's a particular tool in Quill, it's called the statistics page, and you can look at what a convention contributed to the convention, and you can also jigger it so that you measure an individual. And Hamilton stands at about, level 10, and people like Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, James Madison are at about, level 70, all right? So Hamilton's really down there in terms of overall speaking time in the convention. Part of that is he has to leave, he decides to leave early. He had good reason for doing so. But Hamilton is famous or infamous for a speech he gave on June 18th. It was a 5-hour speech, and I'm going to talk about each and every, no, just kidding. Our records of the speech are from 5 different sources, and they each take about, 20, 30 minutes to read. So there's a lot of summarizing of what Hamilton said, so we're not always particularly clear about it. But it involved, probably you guys have heard of this, it involves some statements where he says, I think it would be a good idea if we had a president who had a life term. Okay, you can impeach him, but he's going to be in there for life. He also said, let's have a Senate where senators have life terms, a little bit like the House of Lords or the Roman Senate. Shocking proposals. His veto power for the president is pretty strong. I actually think, though, I won't be able to do it this morning, but I can defend some of what Hamilton says on that extreme level of presidential power. I think if you correlate what he says in the convention with what happens, what you see him saying in the Federalist Papers, that there's a pretty strong case that he made a positive contribution towards the formation of our presidency. It's hard to, locate precise evidence for that, but there's a fairly strong case. But he does say two things in particular, I think really shocking about federalism. My take on Hamilton on federalism is slightly complicated. Basically, it's that at the time of the convention, he is careless in terms of his thinking about federalism. He is out of touch with the way a number of Americans, Madison included, are sort of fumbling their way towards really a new thing on earth, American federalism, which is sort of this compound system. Hamilton's just not aware that move is in the air. He really is thinking very theoretically, very historically, and he fears, you think even more than Madison, the power of the state governments. So I'll give you shocking proposal number 1. We don't have him on record as saying, I don't support Madison's universal negative. He, in a way, goes even further. He says, and he just mentions this very briefly as far as we can tell, he says, each state, their governor, will be appointed by the federal government. So, right now we have the, hearing for a Supreme Court justice. Imagine if all 50 governors each had their little hearing in Congress, whether to appoint them or not. So this is, the national government getting involved in state governance in a major, major way. If people had gone with Hamilton's proposal, thankfully no one, ever mentioned again. And there's also a place where he gives a speech, it's in this June 18th speech, where he says, and I was planning on showing this to you, but you can see how some of the things are going. He basically sort of says, well, we got to think about the money we're going to spend. And he says, the state governments are kind of expensive. He says, if they were extinguished, he was persuaded that great economy might be obtained by substituting a general government. And this is, again, Madison's note summarizing what he said. He did not mean, however, to shock the public opinion by proposing such a measure. On the other hand, he saw no other necessity for declining it. Now, you can look at this speech. It's a little bit like, Bilbo Baggins' birthday party line about, the hobbits that he loves, and I can't even keep track of it. But if you really, parse this out, this is a this is the equivalent of a non-apology apology. Someone might propose this. I'm not, but I think there's really no other reason not to other than public opinion is so dumb, right? I mean, it's essentially what Hamilton is saying. He's essentially saying, I would be for the extinction of the states. Okay, he still says there's going to be some lower administrative units, but that's really what it boils down to. Again, I'm willing to credit Hamilton with a lot. I think there's often a pattern of historians following Jefferson's slanderous footsteps and attributing to him things that just simply aren't true. I do not think he was a monarchist. I do not think he was anti-Republican. I think he was more often than not candid in the way he spoke about his recommendations for the fundamental government. But on federalism, I do think Alexander Hamilton was a very poor guide at the time of 1787. Now, what's complicated about my view is I think that he improves. I think that once he has to defend something that's not his own idea, but it's the idea of the convention, he gets better. And so I think people can find things in the Federalists and say, well, this is an example of Hamilton going too far in the Nationalist direction. There's some scholars that have done good work on this, including Troy Smith, who's going to speak later today. But I actually do think that he's a pretty good guide on American federalism as it was actually established in the Constitution. The Hamilton of the Federalist Papers, the Hamilton of the 1790s debate, and especially the Hamilton who influenced the most important later Hamiltonian, John Marshall of the Supreme Court. I believe that John Marshall's major decisions on federalism were largely correct. And some of that, I think, has to come from Hamilton's own reasoning about the provisions of the Constitution. But the immature Hamilton at the convention is not one that we can ignore. So I feel awful right now. I know I'm giving the enemies of Hamilton ammunition. Okay, I'm talking up this guy and I'm giving you his most embarrassing moment. But this is one of the messy things that you discover when you look into the pages of the convention. The Federalist Papers are a moment of stability, right? The Constitution is a moment of stability. But prior to that, during the convention, there's all kinds of differing opinions. Madison's got this wild idea about a universal negative. Hamilton's got an even wilder idea about federalism. Things settle down at the convention, and then in the Federalist Papers, Madison and Hamilton both defend something that's kind of a yes or no thing. Either you're for this Constitution or you're not. And then in the 1790s, things get unstable again, right? Hamilton and Madison wind up opposing one another. So you've got kind of a messy moment before the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and a messy moment after that. And I think a challenge for studying the founding overall is correlating that kind of that messy area where there's lots of differences of opinion with the kind of thing that we often turn to when we admire the founders, which is what was said in the Federalist Papers and in the Constitution itself. So I'll just leave it there. I feel awful. I'm dissing my guy Hamilton. But, you know, the convention, this is just sort of my way of saying the convention has been neglected by students of the founding, and there's a lot of riches there to be discovered.